I tell you, I'm Barbara Mead. I'm one of the founders of Politics and Prose. I came in to introduce Ron Collins and David Skover because I've done it before, but it seemed like it was just a couple of weeks ago, guys, that I was here introducing you, but actually it was last March that I was here introducing them for their book, Mania, which is about the beat poets, most notably about the obscenity trial of Allen Ginsberg. And actually, Ron and David told me that that book, Mania, had just been named a runner-up for the best American history book at the San Francisco Book Festival. So that's wonderful news. Just wonderful. They deserve it, all of it. They've been here before to talk about the trials of Lenny Bruce. And incidentally, in 2003, they successfully petitioned the governor of New York to posthumously pardon Lenny Bruce. Ron is a law professor at the University of Washington School of Law, and Dave is a law professor at Seattle University School of Law. Together, they have co-authored dozens of articles in this country's leading law journals. So it goes without saying that for many years they have been two of the leading true First Amendment scholars of the law in this country. In that capacity for this book, they interviewed 22 other distinguished scholars, judges, philosophers, historians, you name it. But the list included Howard Zinn, Martha Nussbaum, Noam Chomsky, and Cornel West. And this volume on dissent is the fruit of those labors in which they're all grappling together to define what dissent really means. So you're going to be intellectually challenged this evening, but I don't want that to scare you off. I want to tell you so that you won't get scared off that our authors close the book with a very visual, concrete example of one dissent that I think most of us are very, very familiar with. Is there anybody here who has not seen the 70-year-old man who for over 15 years has been standing about across from the Naval Observatory on the corner of Massachusetts and 34th Street with his various signs protesting priests as pedophiles? Ron and David will talk about that. I was just telling them that here at Politics and Prose that we've had our own dissenters. We've had several authors over the years, of which that we have had pickets outside with signs. And then one time we had something that went actually, I think, a little bit beyond dissent. Ron and David had a name for it, but I can't remember what it was. But Elaine Showalter, who was a prominent feminist author, wrote a book called Herstory. That's a takeoff on history. But Herstory was about women in the 19th century. And Elaine in that book talked about chronic fatigue suffering, the preponderance of women who were chronic fatigue sufferers. The chronic fatigue sufferers network, which we found out is huge, thought that they were being dismissed by the book as hysterics. And they came and at the end of the talk, they stood up here and they locked arms so that the signers could not have access to the author to have their book signed. Well, they were suffering from chronic fatigue syndrome, and after about 15 minutes, they got tired, and the author waited them out, and but that's a form of dissent that we don't welcome here. But if any of you would like to come and protest any other authors, we'd be happy to have you. It's all freedom of expression. So here's David and Ron to talk about their book.
Well, what a joy it is to be back at Politics and Prose. We really feel at home here. I'm very much at home. And it does seem like it was only a few months ago that we were here, and we were. And Barbara, we're so glad that you're here to introduce us. And it's just a wonderful feeling. Our history at this bookstore goes back, at least in terms of books. As terms of patrons, it goes back to when you were across the street. But as in terms of books, it goes back to 1996, when the lady sitting over there was a woman named Carla Cohen. And the book that we did was a book called The Death of Discourse. And since then, we did The Trials of Lenny Bruce. Again, that was with Carla. And then Mania with Barbara, and now on Dissent with Barbara again. Barbara, just hold on. We've got more books coming, so stay with us. You may be wondering why I'm wearing a hat from another bookstore. It's City Lights Bookstore in San Francisco. We were just there a couple of weeks ago. And we bring you good tidings from the owners of that bookstore, Lawrence Ferlinghetti et al. And they said, they reminded us that they're a little bit older. They've been around a little bit longer, but it's another wonderful bookstore. And I just want you to know that when we were there, we wore caps that said Politics and Prose. So we're carrying the message around, and so it's a wonderful opportunity to be at two really incredible independent bookstores. And speaking of independent bookstores, if you believe in bookstores like this, if you believe in the First Amendment, if you believe in writers and reading, if you're still old-fashioned enough to believe in all of those things, just remember that the way these bookstores exist is when you subsidize them, when you patronize them. In other words, when you buy books. We hope you buy a copy of On Dissent, or you can buy Mania as well, or you could buy both of them. But there's plenty of other wonderful books here, and we urge you that whatever you do, vote with your wallet. I've not been asked to make this statement at all, and I probably have made a few feel uncomfortable. But anyway, in these times, I think it's a wonderful example of the incredible status of this bookstore, that the chains have come and gone, and that this one remains. And so do whatever you can to continue it, its vibrant existence. Just a couple of things, and we'll get started. First of all, thank you all for coming. I look out on the audience, some incredible public interest advocates here, prominent First Amendment people, noted authors, people from the public interest community and private bar, and we're all humbled by your, even a few law professors as well, from our own part of the world. So thank you all for coming. We're so delighted you're here. And as always, I'm pleased and excited to be with my wife, Susan Cohen, and my son, Dylan Collins, both of whom are here tonight. So, okay, just a couple of quick things, and we'll get to, I'll move to David. You ready? Yes. Okay. If you need to get spiked, try this. Right. Anyway, we're First Amendment junkies. So when we wrote The Death of Discourse, it was a cultural and satirical look at the First Amendment. When we wrote The Trials of Lenny Bruce, it was a cultural and biographical look at the First Amendment. When we wrote Mania, it was a literary look at the First Amendment. And on Dissent, philosophical look at an aspect of the First Amendment. So we're always looking for new ways to talk, to think about the First Amendment, and to bring whatever insights we think we have to those who are interested in the five freedoms: speech, press, petition, assembly, and of course religion. And On Dissent does speak to those issues. So with that background, let me ask my co-author, you ready? Can you say a few words about why we wrote this book?
Ron and I wrote On Dissent because as we were researching and thinking about our last First Amendment book, it came to us that we had never read a book that dealt with the meaning of dissent. There are many, many books that have been written on the significance of dissent, on why it is important to preserve dissent, but we could not think of a single one that asked in a serious way and answered what it is. And we began to look, very, very thoroughly into legal literature, philosophical literature, and we were coming up with nothing. Nothing. And we realized that this was, whereas there was On Liberty, right, by Mills, On Property by Proudhon, many books about what liberty is, including, of course, Isaiah Berlin, many books on equality, there was not a single book that asked and answered the question, what is dissent? So we decided to write that book. And this is not and this is not focused on why we need dissent. This is focused on what the meaning of dissent is in America. How we talk about it, how we think about it. Because as Ludwig Wittgenstein told us, the great philosopher, unless we talk about something, we don't know what it is. It is what we talk about. And that is, in a sense, the approach we took. Here we decided to examine this concept not just from an historical standpoint or from some normative standpoint, but from a linguistic standpoint, a cultural standpoint. How do we understand this concept in America in order to answer the question what it is? What is dissent? All right, Ron, now I'm going to turn this back to you because I'd like you to talk about one of the unusual features of this book. As you will see when you have your own copy, one of the very first pages lists what we call informationes personae. This is just our way of dealing with the fact that we don't have dramatis personae because this is not a play. We have people who gave us information, and we call them the informationes personae. So I would like Ron to talk about these 22 individuals and why we needed and why we valued our informationes personae.
All right. Just so you know, as we kind of go back and forth, this is how we write books. Every line, every paragraph, every sentence, every chapter, every part of a book we do together. David sits usually at the computer, or not usually, always at the computer, and I walk back and forth, and maybe he'll start a sentence and I'll finish it, or I'll start it and he'll finish it. I know I'm in trouble when I'm talking and I don't hear the keys. It may be an efficient way, maybe not, but that's the way we do it. And so when we talk about it, we kind of go back and forth as well. Style, writing style, is something we pay a lot of attention to. A lot of satire in The Death of Discourse went to great lengths to do that. A lot of literary style. The style in Mania really reflected the poetry of Allen Ginsberg and Jack Kerouac. To some extent, maybe the style in The Trials of Lenny Bruce reflected popular culture. And this here is just a much more philosophical treatment. We tried to not make it boring, but it's a different kind of thing. And so what we did is, since nobody had really, there's not been more than a paragraph at most written about what dissent is. Never. I mean, we researched for years and never been able to find anything, at least in the English language. So we identified 22 scholars, some philosophers, sociologists, law professors, political activists, dare I say your former boss, David Vladek. Ralph Nader was one of the people we interviewed. Actually, we did well by him. Catherine McKinnon, some people who are no longer with us, Howard Zinn, the cultural historian, Catherine McKinnon, feminist. And so we interviewed these folks. We had a number of questions, did audio interviews, and then transcribed them. The transcriptions, if we transcribed them, put them all together, would probably be a 400- or 500-page book. And that may happen, actually. But what we did is, once we had a construct of the book that we wanted, we wove their comments as if it were a dialogue with each of them and with us. So in that sense, it's patterned a little bit after a Platonic dialogue, in that you can almost see the conversation going on, and maybe Nader will make a point and say, oh, somebody else, McKinnon or somebody else, will take exception. And so when you put them back to back, it's almost like there's a dialogue, and then we kind of offer our own comments. And that's how it happens. And they were just enormously helpful to us in developing our ideas about these things. And what was remarkable was the difference of opinion they had, you know. I mean, just a wide range of opinions on what dissent is. So, for example, we asked some of them, I'm going to talk more about this a little later, was John Wilkes Booth a dissenter? Now, we're not asking, the last part of the book talks about whether or not dissent should be protected under the First Amendment. That's a separate thing. We're just asking conceptually. You know, I mean, if somebody doesn't like something and comes by and throws a rock through the window, are they a dissenter? Would we say they were a dissenter, right? And so that's the kind of thing. So when we ask people, is John Wilkes Booth a dissenter? It's almost right down the middle. Half said categorically no. Categorically, emphatically no. And the other half said, of course he is. You know, so, you know, there's this difference of opinion. We had interviewed the editor of Dissent magazine, you know. And it was just Michael Walser. And, you know, it was amazing. I mean, he'd never really thought about it, along with a number of others. And so we had that feedback, and we wove it into our dialogue and developed our ideas accordingly. And they really helped us kind of move things along in this regard. So that's what we did with the Informatis Personae. And we kept refining our views and sharpening them as we went along. So that's what we did with them. Now I want to ask David to tell you a couple of things, give you, if you will, an overview of the book. It's a small book. You can put it in your back pocket if you want. But nonetheless, he's going to give you a nutshell of the book. David?
Thanks. Well, there is a very clear structure to this book. And the structure really came out of our interviews and the information we were getting. There are only 5 chapters in this book. The first 3 chapters are its own arc. And we move from those activities that would unquestionably be understood by all as dissent. For example, a judicial dissent. How do we know that's a dissent? Because that's what they call it. And that's enough. If that's what you say it is, then that means you understand that to be dissent. Right? So we start with judicial dissent, and we have a chapter on judicial dissent and peaceful protest. Then we move, and again, those are what everyone would understand to be dissent. Then we move to uncivil protest. Okay, still within the law, but without civility. This chapter 2 takes up civil disobedience, which may be peaceful or uncivil in tone, but is disobedient to the law. So now we have a transgression of the law. And we ask, would this be seen as dissent? We then move beyond civil disobedience to various forms of violence, going from the most minor of property damage and injury to person to the most major forms of violence, revolution, terrorism, etc. So we move through these activities that certainly have expressive components and ask, would we consider these dissent? Now, as we move in those 3 chapters through these activities, we begin to identify attributes that are key or essential attributes without which you would never say an activity is dissent. We determined that there really were for us only 3. That these 3 attributes must be there, or that it could not be a dissenting act. You talk about intentional criticism that is public. Those were the 3 key essential attributes of dissent. For example, if you wrote only your criticism in your diary and you made sure that your diary would never be published, this could not be a form of dissent. All right? Because it would not be public. It would not be public. It's in your mind. Now you've recorded it, but essentially you've made your own objections known to no one. And we determined that could not be a dissenting act. All right. So you see these three attributes are key, without which there would be no dissent. But then through the 2nd and 3rd chapters, as we're looking at civil disobedience and at various forms of violence, we begin to identify other attributes. I won't talk about them all. I'll just mention one, which, to give you a sense, I think we identify 8 more attributes that are very commonly associated with dissent. But to give you a sense of why we identify these and how useful they can be in helping our analysis, there we had one attribute which we called in-group opposition. By this we meant that you had to be a member of the group, the polity, that you were critiquing. All right? There's a concept in law that's associated with this, and that's called standing. You have to have standing in order to bring a case. Well, in a sense, we said, many would say you had to have standing to be a dissenter. This we found to be very useful in distinguishing, for example, the critique of an American for Iranian nuclear policy. If I critique Iranian nuclear policy in America, I am not a dissenter. I have no standing. I'm not a part of the polity that I am critiquing. Right? And when we got to the more violent forms of protest, like revolution, in-group opposition also became useful to us. Because as we fell out, we agreed with those who said a revolutionary is actually not a dissenter. And part of why we agreed with that is because the revolutionary wants to destroy. He's already outside the society that he wants to destroy. He is not a member of the society aiming to reform it. He wants to abolish it. And because he has distanced himself, he is no longer in the group, and thus we said he loses dissenter status. So we were able to begin to make some sort of very rational, very sort of methodical distinctions about dissent because of these attributes. One of the things we concluded was that the more attributes you heaped on in any one example, the more likely our society would understand that to be dissent. That doesn't mean that even if all the attributes are there, you would necessarily have dissent. But we're talking about probability. How probable is it that one would see an act as dissent if all of these attributes are heaped on? That helped us to explain, for example, why civil disobedience in many cases is dissent, because it has transgression, which is one of the attributes. It has the risk of societal sanction or punishment, which is another one of the attributes. It has in-group opposition, which is another one of the attributes. And of course, it has all of the 3 key attributes. So we were able to make an argument about why, for example, Martin Luther King's civil disobedience would be unquestionably seen as dissent, even if it were not First Amendment protected. The last two chapters are very different. They end up sort of applying these concepts in different contexts. Chapter 4 talks about corporate dissent. That is, imagine, right? The various forms of corporations we have. We have the Catholic Church is a corporation. The NAACP is a corporation. The New York Times is a corporation. And Nike is a corporation, right? And so we talk about, and Ron, I think, is going to deal with a little bit more this whole idea of corporate dissent when he talks about particular elements of the book that are sort of exciting intellectually. And that chapter 4, ends with an examination of aesthetic dissent. To what extent can commercial products be used as symbolic forms of dissent, and in what kind of context would we understand this as dissenting? All right, chapter 5, the last chapter, finally gets to the law. What Ron said earlier applies through most of this book. We are not talking about what the law would sanction, what the law would permit, what the law would forbid. We are talking about the meaning of dissent apart from any legal protection. Now in chapter 5, we finally talk about the relationship between law and the notion of dissent that we've developed. And we found, and we describe what I think is a very interesting and important observation, and that is that dissent has a functional relationship to the First Amendment, that dissent has often been the catalyst that has expanded First Amendment boundaries. In many instances, and I think Ron is going to talk about one, I'll just briefly mention it, New York Times versus Sullivan, the famous defamation case. It is unquestionable that dissent was the reason why the Supreme Court expanded the definition of protected First Amendment speech in the area of defamation. Ron will elaborate on that. So you see, that is the structure of the work. We are there to identify what we think are the telling attributes of dissent, to discuss the concept in the forms in which dissent usually presents itself, from the least violent and the most obvious forms that everybody would agree on to the ones where there's a lot of dispute among, for example, our informationis personae. And then we look at dissent in these specialized contexts of corporate dissent, aesthetic dissent, and the relationship between the First Amendment and dissent. Now, that's the structure of the book. That's what Ron asked me to talk about. And so now I'm going to turn the table back to him, because I want him to illustrate 2 or 3 of the most telling arguments that are in dissent by way of example.
All right. April 14th, 10:10 p.m., 1865. Ring a bell? Anybody? What happened on April 14th, 10:10 p.m., 1865? The assassination of President Lincoln, yes. John Wilkes Booth. We talk about him, and we talk about that evening at Ford's Theater. John Wilkes Booth, a dissenter. Let me just read Ralph Nader. We asked them that question. The line between dissent and violence is clear. Violence simply cannot be called a dissent. It has to be called for what it is, violence. Ralph Nader. We posed the same question to Stephen Schifrin, a prominent First Amendment law professor. He said, quote, "Of course, violent confrontation, property damage, arson, looting, physical battery, rock throwing, punching, or clubbing, imminent incitements to revolution, assassination, terrorism, all right, they'd be disapproved, but nonetheless, they are dissent." There you have it. Ralph Nader, Stephen Schifrin. And that's pretty much how it broke down as we asked people about Dissent and John Wilkes Booth and that atrocious deed that he committed on April 14th, 1865. Part of, as we begin to analyze dissent, particularly with regard to the First Amendment, one of the things that occurred to us, and it occurred to us as we dealt with this problem, this issue, was what is the currency of dissent? What does it do, all right? What is its work product in relationship to the First Amendment? If you say that dissent is all things to all people and somebody comes and throws a rock through that window and that's dissent, if you dignify it with that name, right, then essentially dissent has no meaning, all right? It's whatever, I mean, whatever, you don't have to intend it, right? I mean, a young woman, we were someplace once and we saw a young woman in line behind us and she was wearing a Che Guevara t-shirt, all right? I said, interesting t-shirt, we're curious why you picked Che Guevara. She said, he was, his image was in black and it was on a red shirt. She said, I love the color contrast. I mean, here is, one of the great revolutionaries, right? And in many cultures, this would be seen, maybe even in I was going to say Havana, but I meant to say Miami. But even there, that might be seen as, but if somebody lacks the intention, right? If they lack that intention to make a public statement, is it dissent? And so in answering the Booth question or this aesthetic question, we try to think about, in terms of the First Amendment, what is it the work? What work does the First Amendment do? It's amazing how many acts of dissent, and for example, some of the sit-ins, all right? If those weren't acts of dissent related to racial justice, all right, certain trespass laws would never have been declared unconstitutional. Certain, noise laws, if you will, would never have been declared unconstitutional. Certain defamation laws would never have been declared unconstitutional. There's a whole litany of things that are related to dissent, all right? And that's the work that dissent does, all right? It takes what was once illegal and makes it legal, all right? But in order for it to do that, it has to have some currency. It has to have some legitimacy, all right? And we think, dissenting from Steve Schifrin and others, I think Martha Nussbaum agreed with Steve on this, prominent professor of law, that once you say that it means anything that includes revolution, terrorism, vandalism, and what have you, it loses its currency. It can't do any work, all right? And we think that that work that it does in the First Amendment era is very important. A couple of words on corporations, and I'm sure in this crowd we'll get some flack, but fortunately I saw Bob Cornvera and Lee Levine, two prominent First Amendment lawyers here, and maybe they'll help us. We may need it after this. I mean, these days anybody that even breathes any agreement with Citizens United puts themselves in clear and present danger of acts of violence, maybe even being committed against them. I don't know, but having said that, let me be abrasive. Corporations, can they dissent? Well, you start off and you say, that's ridiculous. Corporations can't dissent. Jehovah's Witnesses. When people came against Jehovah's Witnesses, and the animosity toward Jehovah's Witnesses in the 40s and the 50s was breathtaking, breathtaking. I mean, there were cities that had signs at the outset that said, Jehovah's Witnesses, stay out, all right? They were discriminated against as a group. And the way they fought it was as a group, collectively, all right? The same thing with the NAACP in Alabama, all right? Remember, it's NAACP Inc. The great name of the great First Amendment case that established freedom of association was NAACP Inc. versus Alabama, all right? It's ACLU Inc. I dare say that Public Citizen is probably Inc., is it? Yeah. From that vantage point, I mean, certainly the ACLU can be dissenters. Certainly the NAACP can be dissenters. Certainly the Jehovah's Witnesses, and they filed their suits as a corporation, as a corporate entity. So some people say, well, maybe the distinction is between profit and nonprofit. All right. And, we kind of teased that out. But just at the outset, we wanted to get people thinking that certainly when people act as a collective entity, it is possible, all right, under certain circumstances, for them to be dissenters. So, and we teased that out a little bit. One of the last things I'll say here, more can be said about that, but we'll talk about it during question and answer. But at the end of the book, as David said, we try to talk about having the definition we have, various explanations we have of dissent. We try to show its role in the First Amendment in forever, if you will, expanding the realm of protected expression. The First Amendment is never satisfied, and it can never be satisfied. It always wants more, all right? And because of that, you have to think of the circumstances in which that greater measure of freedom, which some of us think is a good thing and others have some reservations about, okay? I mean, I think it was Nat Huntoff that once said, free speech for me, but not for thee, right? I think at some point that's probably true of all of us. But just in terms of the dissenter, that voice, that persona who offends you, right? We wouldn't need the First Amendment if it didn't mean protecting people who offend us, right? What's the purpose, right? I mean, if we just protect speech that we agree with, we don't need a First Amendment, right? We needed it for those dissenters, all right? Those people who offend us, those people who stand out of line, those people like Lenny Bruce, all right? Those ribald who speak truth to power. There's a wonderful line, tell your boss what you think of him, and the truth will set you free. Right? There you have it. There is the quintessential dissenter. And on that note, we decided to end our book, and I'm going to ask David to read the last paragraph of our book with a story, as Barbara pointed out at the outset, that hits close to home. Think of this person that we're about to describe. Think of him whatever you will. Crazy, wonderful, welcome, disturbed. Make of him what you will. We come not to defend or to criticize his message. But we do think that it's wonderful that there's a person like this in our own community who flies the proud flag of dissent, and that he can do so in a country that will tolerate it. So on that note, I'll ask David to read the last paragraph of On Dissent.
I take a lot of instruction from my co-author, but I'm reading the last page of On Dissent, not the last paragraph of On Dissent.
I think correct.
Yes. In these ways and others, dissent works to preserve our democratic system. It is loyal to that ideal. It is faithful to that principle. And it is therefore skeptical of those who hold that democracy is so perfect that there is no more room for different opinions. While dissenters may well be heretics in the herd, they nonetheless remind us that herd mentality is contrary to the spirit of a free-thinking and freedom-loving people. They goad us even when we savor the stupor of our own folly. There is a man who has stood outside the Vatican embassy, or the Apostolic Nunciature, as it is officially known, for nearly every day for the past 15 years. Passers-by see him at his post, in snow or sun, armed with this or that sign of protest. Some banners scream out in bold black and red letters, Vatican aids pedophiles. Pope sodomizes justice. Other banners are cast in white and yellow, Catholic cowards. The anti-pedophile activist on the Washington, D.C. sidewalk, the dissident behind the signs, is John Wojnowski. This white-haired, 70-year-old man has proclaimed his dissent for 5,000 plus days. His persistent outspokenness is, to say the least, unwelcomed by those behind the forbidding doors in front of which he preaches his gospel of protest. Are his rants true? Are his criticisms fair? Are his accusations over the top? Perhaps, perhaps not. Either way, there is something magnificent in beholding such a sight in our nation's capital. It is a sign of dissent, which is a very good sign in a democracy. Thank you very much for your attention.
I would have to ask, what is the use of a word if it means different things to different people, if there's no consent about dissent? The usefulness of a member of society who focuses on disagreeing on dissent is minimal. And such a person contributes very little to society.
Thousands of years ago, I think in 399 BC, a similar charge was made by an Athenian, made against an Athenian. I think his name was Socrates. A couple of things. First of all, I think it's true from the time of the Athenians to today in any culture. The problem in most, if not all cultures, is not too much dissent. It's too little dissent. Right? I think that's, there is an ideal. The ideal may work, it may not work, but it's still an ideal, it's aspirational. It's the kind of the marketplace of ideas. It's this Socratic principle that however much you know, there's always something more to be known. So I don't think the problem is too much dissent. I think the problem is too little. You mentioned consent. There really can't be consent unless there's dissent as well, all right? And they're kind of two sides of the same coin. And there is something about, if you will, the collective mentality. Simone Weil, in an incredible essay called The Power of Words, written in, I think, 1943, talked about, there's something about the herd mentality, and you kind of just go along. And so sometimes we need that gadfly, if you will, to kind of prick us, to get thinking, they may be right, they may be wrong. I mean, for all we know, the ad hominems against the papacy that David just read, for all we know, they could be over the top and wrong, all right? But nonetheless, the idea, at least in the First Amendment world, is that people, kind of go back and forth and we hear it and we decide for ourselves. If it seems to me, and we wrote about this in The Death of Discourse, that the real problem in modern culture is not so much Orwellian tyranny, although that's always a potential problem, but it's Huxleyan tyranny. That is that people are so concerned about amusing themselves that they no longer take the demos, they no longer take serious discourse, serious conversation, dissent, if you will, seriously. So I hope that answered.
Let me address that. Yes, well, wouldn't it be wonderful if we all understood concepts the same way? Right. That's what you're saying. I think it's impossible. It's impossible. Any word of major significance to any of us is going to have many interpretations. And in fact, that is, we never expected to find consensus on the meaning of dissent. Not at all. What we did achieve consensus on, however, were the three attributes that we've talked about. Everyone agreed. Actually, that's not even true. A few people said there could be private dissent, and we found their arguments unpersuasive. But everyone agreed that criticism was key. That was a key element. Some disagreed even as to intention. They said you could have an unintentional dissenter. And I'm not going to go into depth. The book does that. The book rejects that argument and explains why. But so even on the key attributes of dissent, there was dissension. But I think that is part of the healthiness of the interpretive process. Free speech, my God. That's another term. Equality, liberty. These are all huge ideas on which there is never going to be a consensus. throughout our polity. It is inevitable that there's going to be a range of opinions, and I must say for that reason, I have to reject your first proposition that unless something has a consensus meaning, it's meaningless. I think that's not true.
How did the experience of writing this book change or challenge each of your pre-existing views or notions of the nature of dissent?
Well, we'd been writing about dissenters, Lenny Bruce and Allen Ginsberg and these people. We actually do think that there's not enough dissent in the country. If anything, we're too Huxleyan. We're just too concerned with pleasure and what have you. We didn't really have any preconceptions. At some point, we just got talking at the end of one book, and we thought, what is dissent? And we just got thinking about it. And the more we explored, the more we researched, we thought for sure we'd come on an article or book, never did. And so this was just kind of one of those things that really emerged and blossomed. And actually, I think sometimes people think when you go in to write a book, you know what you're going to do. We really don't. And we're not even sure after writing it we know. Right? But certainly, that was the experience for us. There was another question, ma'am? Sir, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I guess I have trying to choose. I wanted you to pick from any of the following three, actually, only answer one. And the one, I guess, probably maybe the most worthwhile would be, do you have any opinions or sense about the relationship between dissent and the right-hand or left-hand side of the political spectrum? Is it more associated with one or the other? Any fundamental reason why it should be? Another one would be, if you have any new thoughts on the Ed Snowden case in the sense of dissent, throw it. I think everybody said pretty much everything they can be said about Snowden and dissent. And third, is there any reason that the definition that dissent is simply the disagreement within a majority opinion, presumably on the part of somebody in the minority who has standing and maybe has something to lose by dissenting?
Okay. I'm going to do what you said. I'm going to choose one of your three. What was your first question, sir? Because that's the one I'm going to answer.
Political leanings of dissent.
Yeah. One of the things that became very apparent to us as we were thinking through this book and writing this book is that and why we think that this book should be of interest to anyone, is that dissent is not the property of any single political party. Dissent is not the property of any single ideological group. Dissent is not the property of the left. Dissent is not the property of the right. All can be dissenters. All have been in one way or another. And an anti-abortion protester is a dissenter from the right, usually. Right? A neo-Nazi dissenter is who marched through Skokie, or was aiming to march through Skokie. Right? So it is not the property of the left. Yes, we often hear about dissent in the context of the left, and there is a reason for that. Generally, those who have don't need to dissent. The have-nots are often the ones who dissent. They're the ones who usually have a lot to gain and nothing much to lose by dissent. A corporate executive could be a dissenter, but he has a lot to lose, like his job, right? If he were to protest the policies of his company. But he certainly could do it. He could be a dissenter. So I think that what we realized as we were writing this book is that dissent is everyone's property, is everyone's right, and in fact, we argue, is everyone's responsibility.
Yeah,
Last question.
I'll ask this very quickly, and actually my question sort of segues into you. I'm a labor lawyer and activist, and I was sort of surprised when everybody laughed about being a dissenter in the workplace, because I think it very much does belong in the workplace. First of all, the the Statement of Human Rights of the United Nations includes employee rights, which includes the right to fairness, dignity, and respect, which I think necessarily includes the right to speak up. And also, even from the bureaucracy or organization's point of view, it seems that they would want to encourage dissent, because dissent is an element of discourse, and by discourse you come to better results. And also, on the other hand, catastrophe can result from the suppression of dissent, as I can't remember the exact one, but there was a NASA catastrophe that resulted because the upper management refused to listen to the warnings of the lower technicians, that if they followed through with the mission, it would be a disaster. And it turned out that was exactly the case.
Well, first of all, thank you for your comment. Second of all, the statement about tell your boss what you think of him was just an aside. And I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you or me. I wish that more young people knew about Joe Hill and the contribution of the IWW to our First Amendment freedoms. And without the labor movement, undoubtedly the First Amendment would not be what it is. And so if anything I said or my colleague said suggested otherwise, we're certainly happy to correct the record. And really some of the major First Amendment cases have been because of the labor movement and the contribution that they made. And probably now more than ever, those voices are needed. Just a closing comment. Not only is dissent works along liberal and conservative, or now liberal, conservative, libertarian, Tea Party, it just keeps expanding, but it also works in the liberal community itself. My wife, Susan Cohen, is a prominent persona in the reproductive rights world and works steadfastly and done so for decades now, defending reproductive rights. We have differences of opinion about protested abortion clinics. One of us has certain First Amendment views, the other has certain privacy and equality views. I'll let you guess who's on which side. And so there's a fair amount of dissent that goes on in our own home, and we both consider ourselves liberals. So it's one of those things. Sometime when you least expect it, it comes up and bites you. Well, thank you all very much for coming here tonight. We really appreciate it. And